by Jesse Marceau, who as an officer was an intelligent man, a brave man, a man who had served his country, but he served his war in Europe. He had never seen Japanese calligraphy, and even if he had, he would have instantly recognized the cursive, flowery style of most Japanese ideographs, and I doubt he would have been able to have told Japanese from Chinese or other Asian ideographic systems. But in terms of when an ideographic language such as calligraphy is put into military stenciling, it looks very strange indeed, very futuristic. It does no longer has the curved glyphic kind of floweriness that we equate with beauty or some kind of aestheticism. Instead, it begins to look very much like an alien form of hieroglyphics. So in terms of the debris, yes, what he found was rubberized silk. When he crumpled up the rubberized silk, the remnants of the dirigible skin, then it would flow back into form in his hand. He had never run into rubberized silk before. He was not a blimp man. He had served on a I believe he served on a B-24. On a series of them, as a matter of fact, because he was shot down in one of them. Now, in terms of Thomas, the T-H-O-M-A-S, the Native American, this is the kind of racism that we're speaking of, unfortunately. He says he doubts that such documents would ever be shown to anyone who was not a Native American. Well, I was born in Taiwan, but my father was a sailor, a U.S. serviceman. He served in the Navy for 30 years. I was born an American citizen by default. I am an American citizen as much as Thomas probably is, if we give him the credit of the doubt. But in terms of my not being a Native American, I'm sure he doesn't mean that I'm not an American Indian. What he means to say is I'm not white enough to view these records. Well, Thomas, it's for that very reason that I'm not white enough that I was given all the scut jobs that the white guys didn't want to do. People like you, who want to go home and who want to drink coffee or who want to drink on the job, basically hand over to immigrants, or people who they think are immigrants, the hard work. That's why we have so many Mexican immigrants in the United States today. So we can pass on for that in terms of the dwarfs ending the war. Gee, that's as hard to believe as 2 bombs ending the war. This really needs to be emphasized to the American public. These bombs, as developed by the United States, were always perceived, when utilized militarily, as an operational artillery piece. These were simply a conventional firebomb with a radioactive output, and in no way, shape, or form did they do anywhere near the destructive damage in terms of total deaths, in terms of total property destruction that the firestorms created by jelly petrol, napalm, incendiary bombs dropped by the Americans did over Tokyo. And as you notice, all those bombs that wiped out the vast majority of Tokyo never killed the emperor because his bunker system was so effective. And in terms of what happened with the atomic bombs, this is a completely human tragedy on the human level. In terms of its operational effectiveness, the Americans were simply going to drop more atomic bombs as support for their planned invasion, one that would have met with catastrophic disaster had they carried it out, something which they realized when presented with a number of Hirohito's ultimatums that went beyond the biocidal weapons. And in that case, again, Truman wisely sued for peace. He was not a madman like FDR. If FDR hadn't asked for unconditional surrender, Germany and Japan would have negotiated. In fact, he said no negotiations, no surrender, unconditional surrender, total capitulation. No sane nation will ever submit to that. Would America submit to that if given that ultimatum? Well, with people writing into the website with comments like this, it's very hard to decide on what kind of path would be taken. In terms of skeptical ed on the newspapers and debris that were around at the time, yeah, that's something that we can really address when we have time to do so. Since I was given 5 minutes that was stretched out in 5-minute increments, I didn't get a chance to concentrate on the locale of Roswell. Suffice to say that you had the incident take place where atomic bomb tests were being regularly conducted, where you had American air bases, where you had access to where testing takes place. That's why the dirigibles were tested there. In terms of what's going on with the newspapers and what they said, I'm not going to address that at the minute because there's so many articles written on what the newspaper said. We know about Jesse Marceau. We know about Walter Haug. We know about the various releases that were done in terms of intelligence. In terms of the debris found by Billy Mac Brazel, as the records referred to him that I was dealing with, they used the name Billy Mac. Yes, that debris was scattered over a very long range. When Jesse Marceau was in a B-29 that contained that debris, he claimed it took up half of the B-29. He had an enormous amount of people who were arguing against him. There was a individual who was the undertaker for Roswell. Now, since the records I was dealing with mentioned how many of these citizens were dealt with specifically, I do not recall his name at the moment, but in ufological circles, he will be instantly recognizable when I bring up the undertaker who was ordered to make coffins for essentially child-sized bodies. Now, when this undertaker was ordered to make those coffins, and he presented that to the outside world in terms of the fact that I was ordered to make coffins for these child-sized caskets, the response of the Air Force Command at Roswell Army Air Base and throughout the U.S. Air Force was that, oh, we use those caskets to hide the whiskey and all of the alcohol that we fly into base so that the GIs who are at the lower echelons of command don't steal it. So what they're basically telling you is that the higher levels of officer status, the atomic bomb commanders, the people who are responsible for deployment of your nuclear weapons, drink on the job. That's basically what they're telling you, without shame, without disgrace, without embarrassment. Because if they were drinking off of duty, they could go to a bar. But they're smuggling. This is what they're saying, is that they're smuggling alcohol in these caskets. So when they say that, what they're saying is they'd rather have you think, and they don't care that you think that they're drinking on the job, rather than have you believe that they were taking Japanese bodies in those caskets, which Americans prefer to think of as aliens because it dehumanizes the victims of American aggression so far out into left field that they no longer need to take responsibility. Into Intel Retard, the individual, that's his name, that's how he signs his name on the website, Intel Retard says China was an ally of the United States in World War II. Well, tell that to General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, General Stilwell, who was responsible for the CBI theater, thought that the Chinese were not allies at all. And as a matter of fact, this brings us back to the time that my father served, which was originally as a gunboat sailor in pre-war China. Now, my father felt that the favorite movie, one of his favorite movies, was The Sand Pebbles, starring Steve McQueen and Richard Crenna. The book, the novel on which that film was based, was written by Richard McKenna, who had also served many years unhappily, as my father did, as a gunboat sailor in China during the Civil War period of the birth of modern Chinese nationalism. And so he spoke from the heart, he spoke from experience when he wrote that book. The movie is incredibly accurate. I would recommend that everyone see it to get a picture of their Chinese ally. Now what you see in that film is American sailors fighting tooth and claw to the death with Chinese nationalists. Not communists, but Chinese nationalists. So when Vinegar Joe Stilwell, they called him Vinegar for a reason because he was so bitter about this situation, was given this ally in China, then he was presented with basically a functioning enemy per his own claims, as he constantly emphasized to the American government, to the point where he was ultimately ousted from his position of responsibility for political reasons. Now I need to emphasize something to the American people in terms of the complexity of the Chinese front. Many people may, and I've never heard this, but they should, at least on a basic level, compare the Japanese involvement in China to the German involvement on the Russian front. But the Japanese involvement in China was very different in the sense that, unlike what the Germans faced in terms of a mobilized communist superstate, the Japanese faced a civil war situation in which they had communist Chinese, the nationalist Chinese, the warlords, and various other Chinese republics that they were making separate treaties with at separate times, with all of them. And in terms of the largest of these republics, the 1911